We were seated on Wanda's balcony. The night was warm and filled with the perfumes of summer. A twofold roof sheltered us, first the green ceiling of climbing plants, then the vault of heaven strewn with innumerable stars. The low, plaintive call of a lovesick cat floated in from the park, while I sat at the feet of my goddess, telling her about my childhood. "Were these tendencies already marked in you in those days?" asked Wanda. "Certainly. I cannot remember a period when I was not subject to them. Already in my cradle, as my mother later recounted, I was a supersensualist. I spurned the breast of my sturdy nurse and had to be fed on goat's milk. As a little boy, I was inexplicably shy with women, which merely went to show that they affected me profoundly. I was oppressed by the high vaults and shadowy interior of churches, and was seized with anxiety before the glittering altars and the holy images. At times I would steal into my father's library, as if to enjoy a forbidden pleasure, and would gaze upon a plaster statue of Venus. I would kneel before her and recite the prayers I had been taught, the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, and the Creed. One night I left my bed to pay her a visit. The light from the crescent moon fell upon me and bathed the goddess in a cold blue light. I prostrated myself before her and kissed her feet in the way I had seen my fellow countrymen kiss the feet of the dead Savior. An insuperable desire took hold of me. I stood up, threw my arms around her beautiful body, and kissed her ice-cold lips. A deep shudder went through me. Later in a dream, the goddess appeared to me, standing by my bed and raising her arm in a threatening gesture. I was sent to school at an early age and soon graduated to the gymnasium. I greedily seized upon all that the world of antiquity could offer me, and I soon became more familiar with the gods of Greece than with the religion of Jesus. With Paris, I gave Venus the fateful apple. I saw Troy burn, and I followed Ulysses on his adventures. The archetypes of all that is beautiful deeply penetrated my consciousness, and consequently, at an age when other boys are rude and uncouth, I showed extreme disgust for everything base, common, and ugly. When I first began to think about love, it seemed to my raw adolescent's eyes particularly crude and vulgar. I avoided all contact with the fair sex, while being supersensual in the extreme. When I was about 14, my mother engaged a charming chambermaid, young and pretty, with a well-rounded figure. One day, as I was studying Tacitus and going into raptures over the virtues of the Germanic tribes, she came to sweep my room. Suddenly she stopped, bent over me with her broom in her hand, and her delicious lips gently touched mine. The kiss of this amorous kitten sent a shiver down my spine, but I raised my Germania to shield me against the temptress and left the room in indignation. Wanda broke into a peal of delighted laughter. "You really are an exceptional man, but do go on." There is another event from the same period which I shall never forget. A distant aunt of mine, Countess Sobel, came to stay with my parents. She was a beautiful, stately woman with a charming smile, but I hated her because of her reputation in the family of being a Messalina, and I was as rude, nasty, and loutish with her as I could be. One day when my parents had gone to town, my aunt decided to take advantage of their absence to administer justice to me. Wearing her kazabeka, her fur-lined jacket, she burst into my room, followed by the cook, the kitchen maid, and the little kitten whom I had spurned. Without asking any questions, they seized me and, in spite of my resistance, bound me hand and foot. Then, with a wicked smile, my aunt rolled up her sleeve and began to beat me with a long switch. She laid about me so hard that she drew blood, and although I tried to be heroic, I screamed and wept and finally begged for mercy. She had me unbound, but then I had to go down on my knees to her, thank her for the punishment, and kiss her hand. What a supersensual lunatic I was! My taste for women was awakened by the blows of a beautiful and voluptuous creature in a fur jacket who looked like an angry queen. From that day on, my aunt became the most desirable woman on God's earth. My Cato-like austerity and my shyness in the presence of women were nothing more than an excessively developed aestheticism. Sensuality became my own personal cult, and I swore never to squander its sacred treasures on any ordinary being, but to reserve them for the ideal woman, if possible for the goddess of love herself. I was very young when I went to the university in the capital, which was where my aunt lived. In those days, my room looked like that of Dr. Faustus. Everything was thrown together in wild disorder, large closets stuffed with books which I bought secondhand from a Jew in Cervanica, globes, atlases, files, astronomical charts, animal skeletons, skulls, and busts of famous men. At any moment, Mephistopheles might have appeared behind my large green stove in the guise of a wandering scholar. I studied indiscriminately, without system or selection, chemistry, alchemy, history, astronomy, philosophy, jurisprudence, anatomy, and literature. I read Homer, Virgil, Ossian, Schiller, Goethe, Shakespeare, Cervantes, Molière, the Koran, the Cosmos, and the memoirs of Casanova. As this chaos grew from day to day, so did my unbridled imagination and my supersensuality. I always carried the image of the ideal woman in my mind. Sometimes she appeared on a bed of roses surrounded by cupids, in a decor of skulls and leather-bound books. Sometimes she loomed in Olympian garb, with the severe white face of the plaster Venus, and at other times I saw her with the thick tresses of brown hair, the laughing blue eyes, and the casabeca trimmed with ermine that were my pretty aunt's. One morning, when her smiling beauty had once again emerged from the golden mists of my imagination, I set out to seek Countess Sobel. My aunt received me in an agreeable and even cordial manner, giving me a kiss that threw my senses into a turmoil. She was approaching 40, but like most of the famous courtesans on whom time leaves no trace, she was still extremely desirable. She was wearing a casabeca, but this time it was a green velvet one trimmed with mink. There was no longer any trace in her of the severity that had delighted me in the past. Far from treating me cruelly, she allowed me quite naturally to give her proof of my adoration. She found out all too soon what a supersensual, innocent fool I was, and it amused her to make me happy. Indeed, I was as ecstatic as a young god. What delight to kneel before her and be allowed to kiss the hand that had once chastised me. What marvelous hands they were, so well shaped, so white and adorably plump. To tell the truth, I believe it was only those hands I was in love with. I played with them, hid them under the dark fur, held them in the light of the fire, and could not have my fill of gazing at them. I noticed Wanda involuntarily glancing at her own hands and could not help smiling. You may form an idea of the heights reached in those days by my supersensuality, by the fact that I was in love solely with the fierce beating I had received from my aunt, and 2 years later, when I courted a young actress, with the role she played on stage. I then fell in love with a most respectable woman who pretended to an inaccessible virtue, but who finally betrayed me with a rich Jew. You see, because I was sold and betrayed by a woman who affected the strictest principles and the most refined sensibility, I developed a hatred for poetic and sentimental virtue. Give me a woman honest enough to say, I am La Pompadour, a Lucretia Borgia. She is the woman I will worship. Wanda rose and opened the window. You have an extraordinary way of arousing one's imagination, she said. My nerves are all on edge and my pulse is throbbing. If all you say is true, then you are giving vice a halo. Your ideal is a brazen and inspired courtesan. Ah, you are the sort of man who will utterly corrupt a woman. In the middle of the night, I heard a tap on my window. I rose to open it and was struck with horror at the vision before me. It was Venus in furs as she had first appeared to me. Your stories have disturbed me so much that I have not been able to sleep a wink. Come and keep me company for a while. I shall be with you immediately. When I entered her room, Wanda was huddled in front of the fireplace where she had kindled a small fire. Autumn is drawing on, she began. The nights are already chilly. I hope you will not mind, but I cannot take off my furs until the room is a little warmer. Not mind, naughty lady, you know me very well. I slipped my arm around her and kissed her. Of course, I know, she said. But how did you acquire this fondness for furs? I was born with it, I replied. I already showed signs of it as a child. In any case, it is a natural law that fur has a stimulating effect on highly strung people. It exerts a strong and mysterious physical attraction to which no one is immune. Science has recently established that there is a relation between electricity and heat, and that their effect on the human body is similar. Torrid climates make for passionate natures, and warm atmospheres produce exaltation. The same is true of electricity. This is why cats have always had such a beneficial and magical effect on spiritual and impressionable people. The movement of their long, graceful tails, their magnetism, their fur crackling with electricity. No wonder they were the favorite pets of men such as Mahomet, Richelieu, Crébillon, Rousseau, and Wieland. "Then a woman in furs is nothing more than a large cat," exclaimed Wanda, "a sort of highly charged electric battery." "That is right," I replied, "and that is how I interpret the symbolic significance of furs as the attribute of power and beauty. In ancient times, monarchs and noblemen claimed furs as their exclusive right, and great painters used them to adorn their queenly beauties. Raphael could find no more exquisite frame for the divine figure of La Fortinera, nor Titian for the rose-like body of his beloved." "Thank you for the learned discussion on eroticism," said Wanda, "but you have not told me everything. Does not fur have a special significance for you personally?" "Certainly," I said. "I have often told you that pain holds a peculiar attraction for me, and that nothing kindles my passion quite so much as tyranny, cruelty, and above all unfaithfulness in a beautiful woman. I cannot imagine this woman without furs. She is a strange ideal born of the aesthetics of ugliness, with the soul of Nero in the body of Phryne." "I understand," said Wanda. "It gives a woman a haughty and imposing quality." "That is not all," I continued. "As you know, I am a supersensualist. With me, everything takes root in the imagination and finds its nourishment there. As a sensitive and mature youngster of about 10, I came across the lives of the martyrs. I read with a horror mingled with intense pleasure how they suffered the worst torments almost with a smile, how they languished in prison cells, were tortured on the rack, pierced with arrows, cast into boiling pitch, thrown to wild animals, or nailed on the cross. To endure horrible tortures seemed from then on the highest form of delight, particularly if the torturer was a beautiful woman, for to my mind the poetic and the diabolical have always been united in woman. I turned this idea into a veritable religion. Sensuality took on a sacred quality. Indeed, it seemed the only sacred principle, and woman in her beauty became something divine, since she was called upon to perform the most important function in life, the continuation of the species. Woman seemed to be the personification of nature. She was Isis, and man was her priest and slave. She treated him cruelly, just as nature casts aside whatever has served her purpose as soon as she has no more need of it. As for man, it seemed to me that to be abused by woman, and even to die at her hand, could only be pure bliss to him. I envied King Gunther, who was fettered by the mighty Brunhilde on their wedding night. I envied the poor troubadour whose capricious mistress sewed him into a wolfskin and hunted him like game. I envied the knight Stivad trapped in the steppes of Prague by the fearless Amazon Sharka, who took him to her divine castle, and after she had played with him for a while, had him broken on the wheel. "How abominable!" cried Wanda. "I would like you to fall into the hands of such a savage woman. When you were sewn in the wolfskin, mauled by the hounds, or stretched on the rack, poetry would quickly lose its charm." "Do you think so?" I doubted. "You are not in your right mind." "That is quite possible, but let me continue." I went on avidly reading tales of the most fearful cruelty. I gazed with particular relish at paintings and engravings depicting such practices, and I noticed that in every scene furs were the attribute of the torturer. The most bloodthirsty tyrants that ever sat upon a throne, and murderous inquisitors who had heretics persecuted and burned, and all the women whom the great book of history has placed under the sign of beauty, lust, and violence. Libussa, Lucretia Borgia, Agnes of Hungary, Queen Margot, Isabeau, the Sultana Roxolana, and the Russian Serenas of the last century, all wore fur garments and ermine robes. "So furs now arouse strange fantasies in you," said Wanda coquettishly, twining the magnificent sable scarf about her, so that the dark, shining fur played delightfully around her bust and arms. "Come now, how do you feel at this moment, half on the rack?" Her piercing green eyes looked at me with a strange expression of mocking satisfaction. Overcome by passion, I threw myself at her feet and put my arms around her. "Yes, you have brought my dearest fantasies to life," I exclaimed. "They have lain dormant too long." "And what are they?" She put her hand on the nape of my neck. A sweet dizziness came over me on feeling the warmth of her little hand, and on meeting the tender, searching gaze that she let fall on me through half-closed eyes. "To be the slave of a woman, a beautiful woman whom I love and worship." "And who in return ill-treats you," laughed Wanda. "Yes, who fetters me, whips me, and kicks me, and who all the while belongs to another. And who has the impudence, after driving you mad with jealousy, to confront you with your happy rival, to hand you over to his brutality. Why not? Or does the final picture appeal to you less?" I looked at Wanda in horror. "You exceed my wildest dreams." "Ah, we women have fertile imaginations," she said. "Beware. If you do find your ideal, you may well be treated more cruelly than you anticipated." "I am afraid I have found my ideal," I cried, pressing my burning face against her knees. "But not in me?" asked Wanda. She threw off her furs and began to dance around the room, laughing. I could still hear her as I went downstairs, and as I emerged thoughtful into the courtyard below, her impish laughter floated down to me.